Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is A Brave Soldier's Pardon. It says, during our last war with England, it was my fortune to be assigned to the Army of the West and placed on duty in the northern part of Ohio, on the perilous frontier, exposed to the often secret approaches and sudden attacks of the British and Indians. At one time, we were stationed at a post of considerable importance, and here it was that the incident occurred, which I am about to relate. Our position was one of great peril, and we were liable to be attacked at any moment. Our fort, as we called it, was merely an ordinary blockhouse, enclosed by palisades, some of which were old and rotten, with a half-filled ditch on the outside. We had 2 6-pounders, which were mounted so as to command the weakest part. But the whole was so insecure that we feared a surprise might be fatal, and felt the necessity of keeping out a line of sentries to give us due warning of the approach of the enemy. One night, on making the grand round, we discovered one of the sentries sitting down, with his back against a tree, his musket between his knees, and himself fast asleep. I carefully took his weapon, and then shook him quite heartily before he woke. "Goodbye, darling," he muttered in his dream, and then suddenly roused up, with a shout of alarm, and challenged us. "Too late," said I, with a pang of sorrow, for I believed his doom was sealed. I did not at that moment know who he was, but I pitied him from my very soul, for by military law and justice he had already incurred the penalty of death. "What is it? What's the matter?" he eagerly demanded, with only a partial comprehension of the startling truth. This time I recognized his voice as that of an old friend and playmate, who had enlisted in my company at my request, and I am certain I should not have felt worse had I seen his mangled remains lying at my feet. "Oh, Henry Buford," I exclaimed, "why did you let your inclination get the better of your duty, and thus throw away your young and valuable life in disgrace? Do you not know that you have been found asleep on your post, and do you not know what military justice will demand as a penalty?" "Oh God," he exclaimed, covering his face with his hands as if to shut out the horrid vision, "I understand it all now. Had I been alone when I came upon him, I certainly should never have reported him. But there was only one thing for him to do now, which was to send him into the fort under guard, and this I did, shedding tears of pity." The next day, Henry Buford was tried by a court-martial composed of the principal officers of the garrison, and unanimously condemned to be shot to death, subject to the approval of the commanding general, whose headquarters were then between 50 and 60 miles distant, through a perilous wilderness infested with savages. There was little hope of pardon for my poor friend, for his was the 4th case in which the garrison had been endangered by want of vigilance, and the general had announced in a late order that any further dereliction of duty would be punished with the utmost severity. As soon as his trial was over and he had been returned to the guardhouse, he requested my presence. I found him sitting on an old box, his elbows resting on his knees, and his face buried in his hands. When he looked up, his face was very pale, and his eyes were dim with tears. "Ah, Lieutenant Goldie, this is hard," he sighed. "Terrible," said I, taking a seat beside him. "Little I thought when I left home," he pursued, "that such a cruel fate would be mine. Against dying by disease or being killed in battle, I had fortified my mind, but not against a military execution. Well, my doom is sealed, and I have now only to prepare for death. You know Mary Lawson, Walter?" "Yes. We are engaged, and we're to have been married on my return," he said in a tremulous voice. "Ah, poor sweet Mary, this will kill her, I fear. You will see her and break the news to her gently?" "If I live to return," I replied. "You at least have the hope of life, and the almost certainty of an honorable death, while I—" He stopped, as if the words were choking him, and finally burst into tears. "Oh, my friend," he at length exclaimed, "it is not the fear of death that so unmans me, but the disgrace which will attend it. If I could only be permitted to go into battle, to lead some forlorn hope, and fall among the foremost, how eagerly would I embrace the opportunity to leave behind me an honorable name. Alas, alas!" He paused for a few moments, as if lost in the fearful contemplation, and at length he raised his hand and separated a lock of his glossy chestnut hair. "Sever this, Walter," he said, "and take it to Mary with my blessing. Tell her my last words and last thoughts were of her and my poor mother. Ah, my mother, Walter," he continued, grasping my arm somewhat spasmodically. "Think what it will be for her, too, to hear of my disgraceful death. Another lock for her, Walter, and tell them both that the poor unfortunate soldier boy had nothing more valuable to send them. Tell them to pray for me, for somewhere I have read that it's good to pray for the dead. If it were not for them, my friend, I could die more like a man. But it's so hard to contemplate the last separation from all that we love. For me, however, the pang will soon be over. But if it does not destroy them, it may lead them years of misery. Tell me, when am I to die? It's not yet known, he replied. Your sentence must first be approved by General Winchester. And his head. Tell her my last words and last thoughts were of her and my poor mother. Ah, my mother, Walter, he continued, grasping my arm somewhat spasmodically. Think what it will be for her, too, to hear of my disgraceful death. Another lock for her, Walter, and tell them both that the poor, unfortunate soldier boy had nothing more valuable to send them. Tell them to pray for me, for somewhere I read that it's good to pray for the dead. If it were not for them, my friend, I could die more like a man. But it's so hard to contemplate the last separation from all that we love. For me, however, the pang will soon be over. But if it does not destroy them, it may lead them years of misery. Tell me, when am I to die? It's not yet known, I replied. Your sentence must first be approved by General Winchester. And his headquarters are nearly 60 miles from here, he said. And through a dangerous wilderness, I rejoined. There are 2 days then of life at least, he pursued. For no messenger, either mounted or on foot, can go and return sooner. Has there been one yet dispatched? I think not yet. Oh, could you not be sent? He cried, his face for the first time brightening with a gleam of hope. Perhaps I could if I were to make request. Oh, you must then, for my sake, Walter. You must see General Winchester yourself, and before he signs my death warrant, you must tell him what you know of me. That previous to my fatal error, I had always performed my duty like a true soldier, and perhaps he may be induced to grant my prayer and permit me to die in battle. Tell him to place me anywhere he chooses, face to face with the enemy, and if I survive the engagement, I will suffer myself to be executed without a murmur. The idea of a lonely, fatiguing journey of more than 50 miles through an almost pathless, hostile wilderness was not a pleasant one to me, but I felt it was my duty to make the sacrifice to my dying friend, and I promised him I would go, if I could get permission, and would use my humble influence with the general to obtain his last request. I readily obtained permission from our commanding officer to make the perilous journey, and take with me 2 experienced scouts as escorts and guides. And more than this, I was allowed to select 3 of the best horses in the fort to carry us, and every officer of the court-martial, which had tried and condemned my friend, signed a petition that his last prayer might be granted. Every preparation for the journey was made that day, and the next morning, at the first streak of light, we set off. We met with no unusual adventure, and reached General Winchester's headquarters a little after dark. Both horses and men a good deal fatigued with the long, fast, hard ride of that day. An interview was immediately granted me, and I placed my documents in the hands of the general, with a good deal of personal anxiety. I watched him as he read them, and when I saw his lips compress and his brow grow clouded, I heaved a deep sigh of pity for my poor friend. Might I be permitted to say aught of the history and career of Henry Buford, General? I at length ventured to inquire. He raised his eyes, and they met mine with a cold, sharp look. Yes, he replied, with an air of a judge accepting testimony. I will hear what you have to say. I did not make a long story, but I told him something of his early life, his education, his strict moral deportment, his high sense of honor, his family pride, his unexceptional conduct as a soldier, his love for his widowed mother and affianced bride, and ventured to hope that he might be so far forgiven, for the only one great and unintentional error of his life, as to be assigned to a death without disgrace. The general quietly heard me through, but asked no questions, and made no remark by which I could gather whether he was disposed to favorably consider the condemned man's prayer or not. When he found I had done, he simply said, "You will bear back my answer to Major Corcoran tomorrow. You may now retire." Before daylight the next morning, I was awakened, and a sealed document from the general placed in my hand, with orders to set out on my return at the earliest practicable moment. I obeyed, and the following night I was safely back in the fort. What hope from my poor friend? I tremulously inquired of the major as soon as he had run his eye over the papers I had placed in his hand. The sentence is approved, and must be carried into effect tomorrow, he replied. I staggered away, feeling sick and faint. I passed a few painful minutes with Henry that night, and when I left him, he seemed by far the more calm and resigned of the 2. Since I must die, my dear friend, he said, with a firm grasp of my hand, I will endeavor to die like a man and a soldier. I owe you a debt of gratitude I can never repay, for you have periled your life to give me an honorable death, but God I know will reward you. At an early hour next morning, I was a witness of the dreadful preparations for the execution of poor Henry. His coffin, already prepared, was placed in position, and the whole garrison, with the exception of the execution detail and the sentries, was then drawn up on either side of it, where all stood, with sad faces and in solemn silence, till the doomed man appeared, when many a tearful farewell was spoken, for all who knew him respected and loved him. He was very pale, but marched between the two lines with head erect and a firm step. When he reached his coffin, I fancied there was a slight shudder, but he kneeled upon it with apparent calmness and resignation, and spent a few moments in silent prayer. A bandage was then placed over his eyes. The execution detail, with loaded muskets, was drawn up in front of him, and an awful silence, in which every man seemed to hold his breath, followed. As a soldier, I had seen many horrible sights, but none that affected me like this. My very knees trembled, and it was with difficulty I could stand. I heard the fatal orders, "Ready, aim, fire," followed by a crashing report, and I closed my eyes and grasped for breath. I next heard a low murmur, and with a resolution to behold the worst, I again looked at the coffin, expecting to see the mangled corpse of my friend upon it. To my surprise, he was still kneeling, apparently untouched, and the major was standing by his side. The next moment, to my still greater surprise, the latter quietly lifted the bandage and said in a loud, clear tone, "Henry Buford, you are pardoned, and your general begs you will remember him on the field of battle." Cheers, loud and prolonged, greeted this joyous announcement, and I felt as one awakened from a horrible dream to a happy reality. By General Winchester's orders, the soldiers had fired blank cartridges, and life and honor still belonged to Henry Buford. He did not forget his general on the field of battle, was subsequently promoted for his gallant exploits, and eventually returned in proud triumph to make happy the hearts of his fond mother and loving bride. This story came from the great state of Wisconsin, being reported in the Door County Advocate of July 10th, 1879. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.